Digital cultures are defined in terms of distinction and differentiation, discretization. I'm inspired by someone like Raymond Williams and his definition of culture as a whole way of life. So I think of digital cultures really as cultural forms rooted in modes of representation based on discreteness, difference, and distinction. I think of, people often think about computers or the web when they think about digitality, and I like to instead look perhaps in a maybe broader frame. So I think of, the alphabet is a digital technology. The four nucleobases of the genetic code could be understood as a digital technology. Anything that requires a homogeneous substrate of genetic units for encoding could be understood as digital. So that's how I define it. Yeah, I think the potential. This is a harder question, a much harder question, I think, because of the way in which potentiality has been defined as something, at least in my view, as something that is necessary to digital cultures. So I think often in terms of a new sort of landscape in which individuals are looked at maybe not so much as a kind of cog in a wheel or some kind of micro element in a large mass society, but in fact are somewhat autonomous agents endowed with forces and capacities and potentials. So I like to think not so much in the potential of digital culture, but as digital culture requiring a sort of broad parallel landscape of many, many autonomous entities that themselves are conceived of as potent, productive forces. And that can be good or that can be bad, but that's the general observation. If we define digitality in terms of discretization and difference and distinction, then I think that there are basically two dangers. One is that a new form of kind of essential or transcendental identity can take over within this homogeneous substrate. So that would be kind of lapsing toward the universal. And I see that as one danger. Another danger, I think, is lapsing in the other direction toward a kind of purely rationalized particularity. And both of those options, I think, have different sort of outcomes, and neither of them are particularly interesting. So by contrast, I'm much more interested in not so much the universal or the particular, but a kind of middle realm that might be best defined in terms of something like the common, or some authors have also used the term the generic to refer to this middle state that isn't the pure transcendental or essential, and also not this kind of strictly atomized, rationalized particular. Beyond digital culture, that's also difficult. I think beyondness is also something that is itself quite digital, right? Because it requires we might even say a modern concept of a break, looking beyond, breaking with the past, and I'm quite interested in moments that require a break. So if not beyond, certainly we could talk about maybe alongside, or as an alternative to, or even, I would say, even within digital cultures. The obvious, I think, first thing to mention would be the notion of the continuous, sometimes referred to under the heading of the analog or analogicity. Continuousness, it turns out, is has always been a challenge, I think, in Western thought and culture. Curves, it turns out, are incredibly sophisticated and beautiful and hard to understand. Even at the, you might say, the apex of the scientific exploration of continuity, which would be the discovery of calculus. Even there, you see the reduction of continuity to micro differentials, which I think is interesting. So analogicity would be one direction. That often gets wrapped up in a kind of, I don't know, kind of politics of nostalgia, right? The offline is supposed to be more real or authentic than the offline, and that doesn't interest me much. But theories of continuity, I think, do interest me, and you can find those all over in science, in mathematics, and also in philosophy if you know where to look. That's what I think. The second option is actually much more, is maybe less intuitive and less obvious, which is not so much digital or analog, but kind of neither. And so what would it mean to be able to think in a way that doesn't require either a mode of discrete encoding or discrete representation, but also doesn't lapse back into a form of pure continuity. So that's something that I've been exploring under the head of sort of non-digitality, or the idea of withdrawing from computational decision or the digital decision. Simulation, and particularly the notion of a kind of a simulated system or an agent-based system, I think both historically but also technically has a lot in common with developments in computer programming since World War II, really. I see a lot of, my attraction to this has to do with examining the particular qualities of agent-based systems. So I'm particularly interested in an evolution away from a kind of master technology that determines the actions of individual things toward a more kind of, you might say, horizontal architecture within which individual agents are endowed with a certain amount of autonomy, but sometimes that's framed in a kind of heroic narrative about newfound levels of openness and freedom. I think that is true. However, in my own work, I'm always trying to pay attention to the kind of new forms of organization that take place, or that necessarily exist in these forms of computer models, these more kind of horizontal agent-based simulations. And so for me, there's a kind of trade-off and a new level of organization and management that also has its own, characteristics. And I'm interested in trying to identify what those characteristics are. And there may be, benefits to this new approach, but there's also certainly drawbacks to it as well.